When I first met Laura, it felt like the universe was finally giving me a break. I'd just finished my naval service and returned to a life that felt alien after years away. My hometown, Endicott City, hadn't changed much, but I had. Laura was a familiar face from the past, one I hadn't seen since high school, and reconnecting with her felt like discovering an old song I'd forgotten I loved. Back then, I was still untangling myself from the structured life the Navy had ingrained in me. Discipline came naturally, but purpose was harder to find. Laura, with her easy laugh and fierce independence, became an anchor. She reminded me of simpler days before deployments and duty stations, when life was just football games, summer jobs, and weekend bonfires. Our courtship wasn't perfect. We had our clashes. She accused me of being too rigid, and I thought she was reckless with her spending. But we always seemed to find our way back to each other. When I proposed, I thought we'd learned enough about each other to weather anything. Marriage, however, brought out challenges we hadn't anticipated. Jenna arrived a few years later, and for a while, life felt right. Sleepless nights turned into chaotic mornings, but we laughed more than we argued. Parenthood was a juggling act, and though Laura and I stumbled, we never dropped the ball when it came to Jenna. Those years were our best. When teamwork and shared purpose smoothed over the cracks we hadn't yet acknowledged, but life has a way of testing the strength of even the most carefully built foundations. By the time Jenna reached high school, the easy camaraderie Laura and I once shared had been replaced with silence. We moved through our days like actors in a play, hitting our marks but never really connecting. I buried myself in work, convincing myself it was enough, while Laura grew distant in ways I didn't fully understand until it was too late. The truth came crashing down on me one ordinary Monday evening when I walked into an empty house. Laura was gone. At first I thought it was temporary, maybe a fight we hadn't yet had, or her needing space. But as I took in the barren bathroom counter and her missing clothes, the reality began to sink in. The life I thought I knew had shattered in a way I hadn't seen coming. And now, with Jenna finally reaching out, I know the time has come to face it all and give her the answers she deserves. Several days ago, an email from my daughter Jenna popped into my inbox. It had been a while since I'd heard from her, as she's been neck-deep in exams before spring break. Since returning to campus after the holidays, she's been absorbed in her studies and understandably distant. Honestly, it's probably been for the better considering the storm brewing on my end. While Jenna was buried in her books, my life came crashing down. Laura, my wife, walked out with no warning, and I spent weeks in freefall, trying to piece myself together. I didn't want Jenna to get caught up in the chaos until I had some semblance of clarity. Now, with her reaching out, it's clear I'll have to explain everything sooner rather than later. Jenna's finally checking in and is upset. She's been trying to reach her mom, but Laura's email is canceled and the home phone is disconnected. She wrote, "How come Mom's email is gone? Why is the phone disconnected? What's going on, Dad?" Jenna said finals would be done in a few days and she'd drive back with friends. She wants to know what she's walking into. Fair question, but the answer's long and messy. It took me a couple of days to figure out what to tell her. Here's what I wrote. "Hi, Jenna. You've got questions, and it's time for answers. I hope you're sitting down. Your mom left me. She says I'm the world's worst husband and found someone else. Yep, you read that right. I'll give you her new contact info so you can hear her side too. We don't have a landline anymore. Mostly telemarketers and people. I don't care to hear from used to call. I've got a new cell phone and I'll send you the number. Your mom is using Glenn Parker's cell. You guessed it. They're together. I'll share their info too. I know you're on the road soon, so I wanted to give you the basics. And no, you're not the only one asking what's going on. Family, friends, everyone wants the details. Attached to this email is a Word doc with the full story. Read it when you're ready. Writing that wasn't easy. I've never been good at talking it out, which Laura always hated. she said. I didn't communicate enough. I thought I did fine, letting her know when I'd be out with Glenn or at a game. Looking back, maybe I could have tried harder early on, but she wasn't much of a communicator. I exaggerated things. Made you sound worse than you are. It was cruel. Can you forgive me? I met her eyes. Maybe a little, but I'll never forget it. You went out of your way to humiliate me, to destroy me. Sharing that letter that was lower than stealing our savings. Vince, you never gave me a chance to fix things. I cut her off. You just cheated. And yes, Jenna is mine. That's the only relief I get from this mess. Laura didn't argue. You'll stay on my insurance until the divorce is final, I said. After that, you'll need your own plan. You're still attractive. Maybe one day, if you stop chasing Glenn's big appeal, you'll find someone who loves you, but it'll never be me. Laura looked devastated. I found someone, I told her, trying to be as gentle as I could. Her name's Nora, and she's a keeper. We're figuring things out. But I'll tell you this, she likes me just the way I am, needle willy and all. She mumbled something under her breath as she turned and left. And that was it. Months passed, and then Glenn called me out of the blue. Vince, it's me, he said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like regret. I know you hate me, and I don't blame you, but I want to apologize about Laura. I messed with her head. She still loves you, you know, Glenn. I interrupted, my tone sharp and cold. Don't. Just don't. He hesitated, then stumbled into something else. I was wondering about those Bears tickets. Could I go in on them again? I couldn't believe his nerve. Well, Glenn, I said, barely containing my irritation. I already paid for them, but sure, come by with your half of the money. Hand it to me in person. He stammered. Maybe I'll mail a check. No, Glenn, I said, my voice firm. Come over. Prove. You're not scared. If you're still standing after that chat, I'll give you both tickets for free. Silence hung on the line for a moment, and then I heard it. Click. I laughed. I almost had a free shot at him. That was the icing on the cake. But here's the sprinkles. Remember how Laura's job was Tuesdays through Fridays? But she spent those days in Glenn's trailer. Ever wonder why not Mondays? He never told her, but I knew. Think back to those football Sundays. Glenn and I went to games, toasted Brian Urlacher when we won, and cursed Rex Grossman when we lost. Either way, we'd get hammered at Benny's bar, afterward, and pass out. By Monday, Glenn was too hungover to bother with my wife. Real Casanova, fast forward to that fall. Nora and I went halves on Bears tickets. She wasn't a die-hard fan, but any excuse to hug worked for us. We'd cheer, laugh, and cuddle, win or lose. We just loved being together. On a more personal note, from the moment we met, Nora and I couldn't get enough of each other. I felt like a honeymooning bridegroom, never tiring of her, and the feeling was mutual. When I needed a break, we'd just cuddle. Happy to be close. I ended up losing 26 lobs, and my body eventually settled into a healthier place. One day, Nora looked me over and said, "You're starting to look like a Greek god." "Which one?" I asked dumbly. "Bacchus," she shot back with a laugh. "Always a..." My divorce was finalized in July, and Nora announced we were getting married in September. "Why so long?" I teased. She replied, smacking my arm. "It takes time to get a dress and plan everything." Truthfully, Jenna and the ladies said pulling off a wedding that fast was a small miracle, but we did it. We got married and lived, happily ever after. Just like that, Telco was in trouble. We were losing market share to tough competitors. Repair costs were skyrocketing, and our customer service reputation was terrible. Customers were leaving, and our stock hit an all-time low. To fix things, CEO Marshall Sinclair brought in high-priced consultants. They pored over maintenance records, and eventually came to my team. We managed the maintenance database, and they wanted to hear our thoughts. It was surprising. They actually asked for our opinions, so we told them everything. The discussion kept coming back to Vince Moretti, a technician who stood out from everyone else. When the consultants asked, Why Vince was so exceptional, we told them. He's honest, hardworking, and constantly looks for ways to improve. Even after more than 20 years on the job, Vince was driven to be better every day. They noted his productivity spiked twice in January and asked why. Maddie Lyons explained, the first jump came after he made a big life change and decided to focus on being the best tech. Sadie Blevins added, his wife left him, and he was going through a tough time. He decided all he had left was his pride in his work and committed to being the best at telco. Sadie smirked and continued. The second jump happened when he met someone. New, an extremely lucky woman. She stuck her tongue out at me. He wanted to show her how good he could be. I blushed because it was true. Vince had worked harder to make me proud and show he cared. The consultants documented everything and shifted their focus to why other techs weren't meeting Vince's standards. We didn't hold back, revealing padded hours, secret part-time work on company time, and even a black market component repair scam. They asked why Tony Franco, our director of maintenance, allowed this. I stepped in and explained. Tony was an average tech at best, but excelled at brown-nosing. That's how he got promoted to jobs he wasn't qualified for. Tony had turned a blind eye to the tech's behavior because he had done the same things when he was in their shoes. When I tried to explain how these actions raised costs, he dismissed me, too stubborn and incompetent to understand. The consultants didn't need me to explain the Peter principle. They already knew. When their report was presented, it caused a major shakeup. Sinclair forced the COO to resign and personally stepped into the role. Several executives were demoted or dismissed, including Tony Franco, who was fired for incompetence. Vince was promoted to Director of Maintenance, a role elevated to VP level with added responsibility for customer service. The promotion raised some eyebrows because of our relationship, but Vince resolved it by rewriting telco's policies to comply with company rules. As VP, Vince overhauled the entire system. He held a meeting with all the techs, telling them bluntly, you clean up your act, or I'll find new techs to replace you. He introduced time benchmarks for tasks, promising to review outliers fairly but thoroughly. His deep knowledge of the job meant no one could fool him. Some techs failed to meet his standards and were fired. Others quit. Unwilling to put in the effort, Vince demanded to replace them. Vince took an innovative approach. He drew on his Navy background, finding a website listing retiring military technicians. He emailed them directly and sent recruiters to speak with them. Within 3 months, nearly half of telco's 195 techs were new hires, many of them former military personnel. The remaining techs got the message. Slacking off wasn't an option anymore. Productivity soared as Vince's reforms took hold. Vince had always seen what was wrong at telco, but his ideas were ignored by his former boss, Tony Franco. Now, with the authority to act, Vince implemented his vision. His leadership transformed telco, turning a struggling company into a model of efficiency and performance. Vince didn't expect his team to hit his productivity numbers, but aimed for 85% to 90% of his pre-reform standards. Initially, results stabilized around 78 to 79%. To push improvement, he introduced performance bonuses for the top 5 technicians, which increased productivity to nearly 88%. One of Vince's key changes was rewriting the maintenance policy. Instead of scrapping failed equipment, he implemented a replace and repair system, requiring failed items to be brought back for evaluation. Inspired by his part-time work with disabled individuals, Vince created an in-house repair center staffed with disabled workers. They refurbished over 70% of the returned items, reducing new equipment costs by 64%. Vince also introduced serial number tracking for all equipment, assigning unique IDs to every component. He paid overtime for staff to input data from archived records into a database. Though there was grumbling about costs, CEO Marshall Sinclair approved it. Vince then deployed stealth buyers to purchase refurbished telco equipment online, matching serial numbers to job records to identify techs selling company property. This crackdown led to nearly 80 technicians quitting to avoid prosecution. Vince had a pool of qualified replacements, many of whom were retired military techs. By then, 162 of Telco's 195 techs were new hires. Vince's reputation attracted resumes from retiring Navy technicians who appreciated his competitive salaries and benefits. He offered a 10% annual bonus to those opting out of Telco's healthcare plan, leveraging their military benefits to save costs while boosting morale. Vince's reforms eliminated black market schemes, with maintenance costs dropping by 28% in the first full quarter. Sinclair, impressed, continued to support Vince's initiatives. Next, Vince turned to customer service, which was plagued by poorly trained, underpaid, and unmotivated staff. He and I hosted Wilma Fatala, the head of customer service, to discuss improvements. Wilma, frustrated by years of being underfunded, was eager for change. Under Vince's leadership, Wilma gained more resources and reported directly to him. To kick off reforms, Vince and Wilma shut down the customer service line for a few hours and played recorded calls for the staff. The recordings revealed apathetic and unhelpful tones, shocking the CSRs. Vince announced immediate 12% raises, funded by savings for maintenance reforms, along with plans for annual raises and performance bonuses. He then warned, calls like these will lead to counseling and retraining. Continued poor performance could result in dismissal. Wilma followed up with comprehensive training programs. Some CSRs adapted and thrived, but others were let go and replaced. Recruiting proved challenging as Vince and Wilma sought motivated, ethical candidates. At home, one of the ex-Navy techs suggested hiring their spouses. Many of these women, often empty nesters, were resourceful and adaptable. Vince embraced the idea, bringing maturity and reliability to the CSR team. Like the techs, these hires were offered competitive pay and the same healthcare opt-out bonus. 3 quarters after Vince's reforms began, Telco had reduced maintenance costs to 22% below competitors. Customer satisfaction climbed, leading to major new contracts and rising stock prices. Sinclair, confident in Vince's ability, fired 2 ineffective VPs and promoted candidates Vince recommended. Sinclair also assigned 2 retired executives, Roger Platt and Jim Hartman, to mentor Vince for senior management. Platt and Hartman guided Vince as he took on deputy COO responsibilities, overseeing operations with Platt providing oversight. Rumors swirled that Sinclair would soon announce Vince's promotion to CO. Employees, excited to see one of their own succeed, joked about finally seeing Vince wear a suit. As the year-end stockholders' meeting approached, the excitement grew. Employees and shareholders alike anticipated Sinclair's announcement and a glimpse of Vince in a suit. Whenever asked about it, I'd just smile and say nothing. Some surprises are worth keeping. The meeting began with routine updates and a review of the past year's performance, met with polite applause. The mood shifted when Mr. Hartman presented. Financial highlights, revenue growth, rising profitability, and increased stock dividends, earning enthusiastic cheers. Finally, the most awaited moment arrived, the introduction of Telco's new top management team. Mr. Sinclair skillfully built suspense, announcing promotions and realignments before revealing the new COO and deputy COO. Roger Platt and Vince Moretti took the stage together, both dressed in dark gray trousers and navy blazers with Telco's logo embroidered on the pocket, an idea Vince and I had worked on together. As Vince stepped forward, he found me in the crowd, mouthed, "I love you," and beamed at the positive reaction to their uniform. 1 year later, Vince officially became Telco's COO, donning the same Telco blazer alongside the other executives to symbolize solidarity with their new leader. Unexpectedly, Roger Platt opted not to retire. "I'm having too much fun working with Vince to leave," he joked, transitioning to deputy COO to continue mentoring Vince and supporting Telco's resurgence. By the end of Vince's first year as COO, Telco had reclaimed its position as a market leader, challenging its main rival and outperforming expectations. Vince's leadership had revitalized the company, and the board, shareholders, and employees were thrilled. Shortly after Vince's promotion, Mr. Sinclair and his wife invited us to dinner. Over a warm and lively meal, the wives stepped away, leaving Vince alone with Sinclair. The CEO leaned in and asked, "How does it feel?" Vince hesitated. "Honestly, like I'm dreaming. I keep expecting you to walk in and say, 'Nice try, Moretti,' but there's no way you're COO material." Sinclair chuckled, surprised. "Why would I say that?" Vince admitted. "I'm not like other executives. I don't have the polish or patience for boardroom games. I talk like a grunt and tell people exactly what I think. I don't fit the image of a COO. Sinclair shook his head. "You're confusing. Polish with capability. Most of those polished executives grew up privileged. It's about appearance, not ability. What I need in a COO is a problem solver. And that's exactly what you are. You've turned telco around by identifying issues, making bold changes, and delivering results. Yes, you've made mistakes, but you've learned quickly and adapted. The stockholders think you're a miracle worker. Telco's value is up, dividends are strong, and the company is thriving. Vince, this isn't a dream. You belong here, and I'm confident about the future for you, me, and everyone tied to telco." As Sinclair raised his glass, the women returned. "What are we drinking to?" Mrs. Sinclair asked, taking her seat to our miracle man, Keogh Vince Moretti, Sinclair announced with a grin. We all toasted to Vince's success, but I caught his eye and let a teasing glint show. Vince noticed immediately, bracing for the playful ribbing I had in store once we were home. He smiled, ready for whatever I planned. It was moments like this that reminded me why we worked so well together. Vince's humility and humor made him one of a kind, and the night promised to be as fun as it was long. Herself. She kept her interest to herself and dismissed mine as guy stuff. Eventually, I gave up trying and stuck to my own thing. Turns out she did the same, but with Glenn, my so-called best friend. Here's the kicker. Laura and Glenn left together. They bailed right after the last Bears game in January. Glenn and I had gone to that game like we always did. We had season tickets together for years. Win or lose, we'd hit Benny's afterward, get drunk, and I'd stumble home to an angry Laura. He'd go back to his rented room. But that Monday after the game, Glenn skipped drinks, saying he had something to do. I didn't think much of it until I got home the next day and saw the empty bathroom counter. Pink tile I hadn't seen in years. Laura was gone. She left a letter calling me lazy, selfish, fat, and disgusting, said she'd been with Glenn for over a year and that he was a real man. Unlike me, they were heading west to start fresh. I cried, like I hadn't in years. Then I got sick. By the end of that night, I was empty, physically and emotionally. After all these years, I thought I knew her. Turns out I didn't know her at all. Let me back up a bit. Glenn, Steve, and I all grew up in Endicott City with the neighborhood kids, including Laura. She was a tomboy until she hit 13 and started to develop. Then she turned into a tease, fully aware of her effect on us. For a while, Glenn and I fought over her, but eventually I won. Now it seems they're gone, just like that. At first, I didn't know it was Glenn. I thought she'd run off with some random guy. I called everyone, her family, friends, boss, trying to find her. Her boss, still mad she quit without notice, told me Laura just up and left one day. That was the first clue, but it didn't prepare me for the truth. For a year, Laura got up with me every morning, left for work, and came home acting exhausted. The whole time she was carrying on an affair, and now she's gone with Glenn and cleaned out our bank accounts to boot. The betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd loved her, never cheated, and worked extra jobs to make ends meet. Meanwhile, she'd been sneaking around. I couldn't process it. Even her friends and family didn't seem shocked when I told them. Their reaction suggested they'd known or suspected what she was up to all along. Monday night, after exhausting my calls, Steve Rogers finally reached me, reminding me of a poker game Sully had set up at a local strip club. Glenn and I had been there before. The bare-chested women would lap dance for a few bucks or more if you had cash. Glenn often indulged. He was single, so there wasn't much fallout for him, but it bothered me. These girls were the same age as my daughter Jenna and could have been her high school classmates. I never cheated, not even when I had the chance. I'd had my fun before marriage, especially during my Navy days in Japan. But once I said I do, I meant it. Glenn, on the other hand, never could stay faithful. He'd been married twice, both short-lived because he couldn't keep his pants zipped. Laura and I had reconnected after my Navy years. She said Glenn had broken her heart too many times and she missed how I treated her. I still loved her, so we got married. Looking back now, it feels like a cruel joke. The truth is, Laura and Glenn's betrayal shattered my life. I used to judge the guys at the strip club who cheated on their wives. Now I'm just left wondering how I could have been so blind to the U.S. I thought we had. Turns out there's no us anymore, Steve called, reminding me about the poker game at Sully's club. I asked if the dancers were waitressing and making money from the guys. He confirmed, joking that they were up close and personal. I wasn't amused. Most of those guys struggled to pay bills, and here they were throwing away money that should have gone to their families. I asked if Glenn was there. Steve said no. He hadn't been able to reach him either. Then Steve asked if I was coming, and I said no. I told him I had too much on my mind to watch men chase girls their daughter's age. Steve got defensive, told me off, and hung up. Left alone. I started putting the pieces together. Glenn hadn't called, nor had he shown up at my house, which he usually would have done if he couldn't reach me. That was odd. I drove to his trailer, but I already knew what I'd find. It was gone, along with his SUV. Laura and Glenn had run off, together. Her note had called me a boring, lazy, selfish, fat slob with a needle willy and gloated about her mind-blowing relationship with Glenn. She wrote that they were starting a new life, and I should divorce her, though she doubted anyone would ever want me. Rereading the letter crushed me. The first time I'd skimmed it, the insults hadn't fully landed. This time they did. Laura hated me, and probably had for a long time. Worst of all, I couldn't argue with most of what she said. Boring, lazy, selfish, fat slob. The cruel words echoed as I thought about how I'd failed her and myself. Over the next days, I threw myself into work. I stopped cutting corners, padding hours, or taking breaks. Work became my only escape, my way of proving I wasn't entirely worthless. I avoided my co-workers suspecting they looked down on me, knowing or guessing the truth about Laura and Glenn. At home, I thought about my failures constantly. I stopped drinking, playing poker, or hanging out. All I could see in others' eyes, friends, co-workers, even strangers, was pity or scorn. I didn't need their judgment. I judged myself enough. I looked up the term duped spouse online. That's what I was now, pathetic, clueless, and humiliated. I had to face facts. Laura was gone for good. Even if Glenn vanished tomorrow, she'd just find someone else. And if she ever tried to come back after that brutal letter, no way would I take her back. Then I wondered, what about dating again someday? The idea felt impossible. I was the boring, selfish, fat slob with the needle willy. Remember? Who'd want me? My marriage was over, but I couldn't imagine a future with another woman. Jenna was the only female presence I could picture in my life. Looking back, I realized how much I'd failed as a husband, wasting time, living separate lives, and hanging out with other guys in the same rut. Sure, I'd made mistakes, but plenty of husbands like me didn't have wives who ran off with their best friend. So what made me worse? Still, this wasn't a pass for Laura. She betrayed me, our marriage, and Jenna. But I couldn't control her actions, only my own. I thought about the life we'd shared, laughing, crying, raising Jenna, and even praying together when she was sick. It was real, and I gave her everything I had. Yet in the end, it wasn't enough. I failed as a man and a husband. I couldn't see how I could ever start again with someone else. What could I offer that I hadn't already tried and failed? The letter had gutted me, and the thought of a new relationship felt hopeless. I resigned myself to a long, lonely future. And maybe I deserved it. Why had it been so easy to go out with the guys instead of building a life with Laura? I worked, avoided booze, and went straight home, but the solitude gave me too much time to think. I obsessed over my flaws, boring, lazy, selfish. I replayed our past and wondered if I'd tried harder. Would it have made a difference? Probably not. Even if I fixed one thing, there were still so many others. I'd always been selfish with my time, prioritizing friends and hobbies over her. And though I worked hard to provide for Laura, I gave little of myself emotionally. She tried to involve me in her interests early on, but I gave up too easily when she brushed me off. And then there was the question of ugly. I wasn't Glenn, who always got the attention, but I didn't think I was hideous either. In high school and the Navy, I dated and had flings. Plenty of them. Were they all blind? Maybe I wasn't much to look at, but ugly felt harsh. I stared in the mirror and thought of a Shakespeare line. An ill-favored thing, sir, but mine own. That summed it up. I wasn't much, but I was what I was, and that wasn't enough for Laura. The more I studied my reflection, the worse I looked. Maybe I wasn't awful in my younger days, but now with extra weight and lines on my face, I felt undeniably ill-favored. Most nights I'd spiral into the same endless loop of self-criticism until exhaustion set in. One night, tired of going in circles, I decided to focus on one thing, my appearance. Fat slob was a given. I didn't need convincing there, but at least I could work on it. Since Laura left, I'd been putting in time on the stationary bike and Bowflex, shaving off inches. But what about ugly? Could I fix that at 45? I had to know. The Navy had taught me systematic problem solving, so I approached the question methodically. How ugly am I? Or maybe am I that ugly? The answer couldn't make me feel worse about 10 days after Laura left. I decided I needed a woman's opinion. Asking a guy was out of the question, so I thought of Nora Ashford, an office manager who'd always been warm and friendly. Her look wasn't pity, more like kindness, and she seemed approachable. Nora was smart, attractive, and probably a little older than Laura. I decided to approach her at work. Walking into her office, I froze, tongue-tied. I'd rehearsed what to say, but it vanished the moment she greeted me with a smile. "Vince, what's up?" she asked, sensing something was on my mind. "Would you think about having lunch with me?" I stammered. I need a woman's advice about something." She smiled, amused but not dismissive. "Intriguing. Sure. When and where?" "How about now, Benny's?" I blurted, then immediately worried. It was too short notice. "Relax, Vince," she said gently. "This isn't a romantic date, right?" Flustered, I stammered, out of denial. She took pity on me and told me to wait while she freshened up. I stood awkwardly in her office. Suddenly aware of the women around me, they had stopped working and were watching me with curiosity, whispering among themselves. I became painfully self-conscious of my uniform, my gut, and everything Laura's letter had drilled into me. Were they staring at me, judging me, enjoying the attention? Came Nora's teasing voice, startling me. She returned, grabbed her purse, and said with a grin, "Come on, Vince. Let's eat." When Vince came home on that Monday night to find Laura had left him, he had no clue he'd become a minor celebrity at Telco. You've already heard how Vince approached his work differently from most of the other technicians. Unlike the ones who cheated the clock, worked side gigs on company time, or fooled around with lonely housewives, Vince wasn't alone in noticing these antics. In my role, my team handles all the logs and work records, feeding them into the company database. When my boss got promoted to director of maintenance and I took over, I pushed for a new database system. The old one, installed under my predecessor, Tony Franco, had become outdated. Tony was a textbook example of the Peter principle, getting promoted to a position where he was out of his depth. He'd gone from being an average technician to running my section, a role where he struggled. Now that's my job. The best thing Tony ever did was stay out of my way and let me handle the work. The second best? Sucking up to the higher-ups, which somehow got him promoted yet again, despite his incompetence. We produce weekly and monthly status reports, and guess who consistently topped the charts? Vince. He completed the most jobs, handled the most work per day, and excelled in every positive metric. Fewest callbacks, highest customer satisfaction, and lowest complaint rates. Vince always ranked at or near the top. Two others occasionally came close, Terry Spears and Rick Cooper. Terry was Tony's son-in-law and a shameless brown noser who got all the easy jobs to inflate his stats. Everyone saw through it. Rick, meanwhile, was decent but dishonest. He'd fix a cabling issue, tell the customer their phone was faulty, replace it, and then sell the perfectly fine phone on the side. Rick's bragging gave him away, and that's how we knew he was stealing from telco. Vince, on the other hand, was the opposite of these guys. My team of 23 women unanimously agreed. He was telco's best technician. Vince didn't cheat the company, slack off, or exploit company resources. He didn't cheat on his wife either. He worked hard, and by all accounts, he was a genuinely kind man. Even before Laura left him, Vince admitted he wasn't pushing himself as hard as he could. But we didn't just rely on numbers. We gathered info through observation and good old-fashioned curiosity. Guys loved to talk, bragging to friends, girlfriends, or drinking buddies. And that loose talk got back to us. My team's social circles included plenty of these girlfriends, and we heard it all. Who was slacking, who was fooling around, and who was running scams. That's how we uncovered Rick's theft. Vince, though, he was clean. A straight arrow. Here's what I knew about Vince Moretti. He was the hardest-working, most dependable tech we had. He didn't lie, cheat, or cut corners, and the people who knew him best described him as a genuinely sweet man. That made it even harder to stomach that. Laura left him for some loser. What a fool. One of my team members said. When Vince walked into my office to invite me to lunch and ask my opinion on something, I'd already made up my mind. I wanted to get to know him better, not just because of his stellar record, but because I'd read the letter. It didn't align with the man we all knew, and I was curious to form my own impression. Nora and I sat in a back booth at Binny's finishing our meal. I had a chicken Caesar salad, no croutons, trying to work off the fat slob label, while Nora had a veal parmesan sub with fries, onion rings, and iced tea. She didn't seem concerned about watching her figure, and honestly, she didn't need to. I was already admiring it discreetly. I was relieved she didn't smoke. I'd quit in the Navy, and Laura's refusal to do the same was always a sore spot. She'd just snap at me to mind my own business. Nora sipped her tea, looked me in the eye, and said, "Thanks for lunch, Vince. Now let's hear it. What's your question?" Caught off guard, I'd been absent-mindedly staring at her chest. Embarrassed, I stammered, Right. I've been told but couldn't bring myself to say it." She smiled, not offended, and waited. I tried again. "Nora, from a woman's perspective, do I look?" But the words stuck. I sighed, shaking my head. This was a mistake. I started to slide out of the booth, but Nora grabbed my arm firmly. "Don't leave, Vince. I think I know what you're asking. Let me help." She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse. "First, I want to read you something." I froze as she unfolded the letter. Oh, God, no. I thought Laura's letter, the one tearing me apart, was now being read aloud. Nora recited it neutrally, but the shame and anger burned through me. "How did you get that?" I whispered, barely holding back tears. "Laura emailed it to her friends," she explained softly. "It got forwarded everywhere, all over town." She nodded. "Everyone knows." I put my head down on the table, overwhelmed. Everyone knew what Laura had said about me. That letter, those words, were my public humiliation. Nora put her hand on my shoulder, her grip steady and comforting. "You're not going to hide, Vince," she said firmly. "Here's what you're going to do. Pay the bill, tip generously, and take me. Back to the office, then go home, shower, and come to this address at 7 p.m. sharp. She handed me a card with her address written on it. Bring 2 bottles of wine. We have a lot to talk about. And no, you're not allergic to chicken curry, are you? I shook my head, too stunned to argue. That evening, I arrived at her house at 7:05, with 3 bottles of wine and some bread, unsure of what to expect. Nora greeted me warmly, inspected the wine, and declared me a genius for bringing extra. She put the wine in the fridge, except for 1 bottle, which I opened for her. We toasted to a beautiful friendship, her grin widening when I recognized the Casablanca reference. Dinner was incredible. Chicken curry with garlic bread. The meal was rich, flavorful, and paired perfectly with the wine. By the time we finished the first bottle, I was relaxed for the first time in weeks. Dessert can wait, Nora said with a smile, excusing herself. As I poured another glass of wine, my thoughts drifted to her. The kindness in her eyes, her easy humor, and yes, that dress. Let me tell you about that dress. When Nora came downstairs, I couldn't help but notice it was bright yellow, complementing her red hair beautifully. But it was the design that caught my attention. Strategically placed cutouts revealed just enough to tease a glimpse of her toned sides, the curve of her lower back, and even the tops of her thighs through a high slit. She wasn't wearing a bra unless it was some invisible type, and the effect was stunning. I couldn't ignore my reaction, though Nora pretended not to notice. She smirked as she sat beside me on the couch, holding Laura's letter. My earlier excitement quickly faded as the weight of the moment returned. Vince, you asked if the whole world had read this, she said softly. And I told you pretty much you wanted to run and hide. I could feel it in the tension in your shoulders. She smiled faintly, but grew serious. I'm going to read it again, and then I'll tell you my opinion. I think that's what you really wanted when you asked for my perspective. It's about the list, isn't it? I nodded, feeling exposed. Go ahead, I said. She read the letter in full, her voice neutral. Hearing Laura's harsh words again was like a punch to the gut. I sat frozen, ashamed and angry. How did you get that? I managed to ask, barely holding back tears. She emailed it to her friends, Nora explained. It spread. Everyone in town has read it. I buried my face in my hands, overwhelmed. Now I understood the strange looks I'd been getting. Everyone knew. Nora placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Vince, I've read that letter, and I've talked to the women at Telco who've read it. You know what we think? It says more about Laura than it does about you. I looked up, confused. We see you, how you treat people, how you work hard. Vince, you're one of the kindest men we know, she said earnestly. And Laura? She sounds bitter, mean-spirited and spoiled. She leaned closer, her gaze steady. Laura cheated. On you, shut you out, and ran off with Glenn, a man everyone knows as a selfish, immature womanizer. And that list she wrote? None of us believe it describes you. Nora paused, letting her words sink in. Tell me, Vince, did Laura ever talk to you about those things? Did she ever tell you she was unhappy, that she found you boring, or that she needed more from you? No, I said firmly. She wanted me to communicate, but she never said anything like that. I know I fell into a routine. I spent too much time with my friends and not enough with her, but she wasn't exactly a ball of fire herself. She never wanted to join me in activities, and when I suggested things like dancing, hiking, or even taking a class together, she shot it down. She wanted her own space, her own friends. I felt my frustration rising. She didn't try either, Nora. She was boring, too. Maybe I failed her, but she failed me, too. Nora nodded, her expression compassionate but firm. You've been carrying all the blame, Vince. Maybe it's time to let some of it go. Nora poured me another glass of wine, and I quickly drained it. The Zinfandel, whatever color it was, went down too easily, and she refilled my glass as we continued talking. Was I lazy? I said aloud. Maybe I wasn't a whirlwind of productivity at home. I did my chores when Laura asked, helped with the vacuuming and dishes, and I was pretty hands-on with Jenna as a baby. But I guess if I wasn't working or out with the guys, I was just sitting around. Vince, Nora asked, what did Laura do all day? Did she work? I thought she did, I admitted. She said she had a part-time job answering phones at a temp agency, but I recently found out she quit and spent that time with Glenn instead. So no, she wasn't working. So she spent a few hours a week working with Glenn and still wanted you to do more housework? Nora said with a wry smile. I laughed. Yeah, that sounds about right. Nora shook her head. Couples should share chores, sure, but fairly. How many hours were you working? I thought for a moment, starting to feel the effects of the wine. I worked 8 hours a day at Telco, plus an extra 2 hours most evenings at a repair shop. Saturdays. I put in another 4 hours. That's 54 hours a week, give or take. I don't do the extra job now. Turns out I can manage the bills fine without her spending habits. So she worked 0 hours a week while you worked over 50 and she called you lazy. What a princess, Nora said dryly. I smiled. It does sound pretty unfair when you put it that way, but I always believed in splitting the work, especially child care. I figured, she said. You're the type to get involved with your kid. Oh, I loved it, I said, smiling at the memory. Baths, diapers, feedings. I did it all. It made me feel closer to Jenna, even when it meant getting peed on occasionally. Nora's expression softened. Vince, that list Laura wrote. It's garbage. Let's go through it. I nodded, and she picked up the paper again first. She said, ugly. That's ridiculous. You're not winning beauty contests, but you're far from ugly. Honestly, Vince, I've been looking at you all evening and I like what I see. Laura must have been projecting her own ugliness onto you. She leaned closer. Let me tell you something. There are plenty of men out there more conventionally, handsome than you, but they're cheaters, liars, and users. You. I can think of at least 30 women who'd be thrilled to be sitting here with you right now. And most of them wouldn't care about a few extra pounds. Nora's voice turned playful. Speaking of which, let's tackle the fat slob thing. You're not even that heavy. Sure, you've got a bit of a spare tire, but it's manageable, and I'm going to help you with that. I laughed. You've got a plan? Absolutely, she said, her eyes sparkling. And it starts right now, Nora, I began, but she cut me off. Vince, look at me. Her gaze locked onto mine, those beautiful eyes impossible to ignore. Here's the deal. If you lose 10 LABs in the next 2 months, I'll make it worth your while. Indefinitely. I blinked. What does that mean? She leaned in, her voice dropping. It means I'll be yours, Vince, if you want me. I was stunned. Wait, you're serious? Completely, she said, smiling. And as a bonus, I'll personally investigate the last item on your list. You know, the Needle Willy thing. Her teasing broke the tension, and we both laughed. But then she stood, pulled off her dress in one smooth motion, and left me speechless. Nora was stunning, her curves and confidence reminding me of a painting I'd once admired in a museum. The rest of the weekend was unforgettable. We spent hours exploring each other, laughing and connecting in ways I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't perfect. I fell out of bed twice trying to get fancy, but it was real and it felt like a fresh start. During lunch on Saturday, Nora grew serious. Vince, I need to tell you something. I'm not the kind of woman who brings guys home on a whim. I brought you here to talk and maybe flirt a little, but when I saw how much pain you were in, something shifted. You're a kind, good man, and I felt things I haven't felt in a long time. She reached for my hand. I didn't expect this, any of it, but I'm glad it happened. I smiled, squeezing her hand. So for the record, am I ugly or not? Nora laughed as she took my hand and led me back upstairs. Yes, Vince, you're ugly, she teased. So ugly. I can't stop staring at your face. Haven't you noticed how I always close my eyes when we kiss? Here, let me show you. When we paused, she smirked. And you're boring. Lazy, too. I mean, you've spent almost the entire weekend in my bed. Her tone softened as she added, Oh, Vince, those feelings I had at Benny's, they've grown so much stronger. Now that I have you, I don't want to let you go. I want you all to myself. If agreeing with that letter keeps other women away, then so be it. I want to be the only one to tempt you. Her eyes grew misty. Am I scaring you off? Standing without clothes in her bedroom just inches apart, I focused and answered. Nora, I want to keep this going for as long as we can. I'm never going to get tired of you. Or at least not until I lose those 10 lbs. She grinned. And after I've helped you lose the 10 lbs, we'll reassess the situation. I teased and decide if there's more work to do on my love handles. Laughing, she added, If you get too skinny, I'll send you to cooking school so we can fatten each other up and keep things going just like this. She showed me exactly how committed she was to the plan. I reluctantly went home Sunday night, utterly spent, but feeling like a new man. Nora had turned my life around completely. It wasn't just about the Zex, though. That was incredible. It was Nora herself, her warmth, humor, and compassion that made me feel alive again. Monday, I threw myself into work. I took on the toughest, service calls, and even stayed late to finish a project. Part of me wanted to impress Nora, knowing she'd see my efforts in the logs. On the drive home, Nora called. How are you feeling? Any second thoughts? She asked playfully. Not a chance. I replied, I was just wondering when I'd get to see you again. Tonight, she said. I'll bring Chinese to your place at 6:30, and don't forget we have a deal. I'm yours, Vince, she added. Oh, and when are you coming to my office? I want to show you off to the girls Friday when I drop off my paperwork, I said. Good. Be there by 4:45, or I'll make your life a living hell, she teased when I arrived on Friday. Every set of eyes in the office turned to me. Nora finished her call, walked straight over, and kissed me as if no one else existed. Breaking the kiss, she turned to her team with a grin. Don't believe everything you've read, girls. And for the record, Vince is all mine. I could barely speak, managing only all yours. By Saturday afternoon, Jenna arrived home with her friends, waving a print out of my email. Dad, where is she? I have to meet Nora. She's inside, I said, trying to steady my nerves. Nora had insisted on meeting Jenna, saying it was better to be upfront about us. Out on the deck, Jenna and her friends interrogated Nora while I fetched iced tea. Make yourself scarce, Jenna ordered. Yes, ma'am, I said, knowing who was in charge. I peeked out the kitchen window. From my clueless perspective, not much seemed to be happening. Jenna and Nora talked, exchanged a few glances, and then, unexpectedly, Nora's eyes welled up. Jenna pulled her into a hug, and soon they were crying together. Meanwhile, Jenna's 3 friends came into the kitchen, leaning against the counter and staring at me like I was the main attraction. It was uncomfortable, and I couldn't figure out why they seemed so fascinated. Finally, Loretta broke the silence. We read your email, she said. You told Jenna everything. That was admirable. I nodded, unsure what to say. She continued. Mr. Moretti, your wife's letter? It's the worst thing I've ever read. I sent it to my dad, and he said if he ever got a letter like that, it would have been a double homicide. Great, I thought. Now my infamy had spread beyond town limits, but Loretta added, your story. Dedicating yourself to work, getting in shape, meeting Nora. We all cried. It was beautiful, romantic, and a little, Tiffany chimed in. That chicken curry dinner. So dreamy. I hope I have a night like that someday. Do you think Nora will share the recipe? Loretta went on. Don't worry about what's going on out there. Jenna and Nora are hitting it off. Do you know what Nora said about you? She told us the only men asking her out before you were losers and creeps. Then you came along, stammered out a lunch invitation, and changed her life. She called you a gift of love when she thought she'd be alone forever. That's so romantic, I can hardly stand it." She paused, then added, "She'd do anything for you, and I guess you'd do the same for her." "I would," I said, "and I'll never take her for granted. I've learned that much." Eventually, Jenna and Nora came inside, arm in arm, both glowing. They'd formed their own little admiration society that night. Jenna's friends stayed over before heading home to their families. Jenna stayed with us for 10 incredible days. She worried her presence might cramp our style, but Nora laughed it off. "If you don't like the sights and sounds," Nora teased, "you better wear earplugs and blinders. I plan to keep your dad begging for mercy," she says. "I still have a little flab," Jenna quipped, smirking. After that, she learned to knock before entering closed doors. On her last day, waiting for her friends to pick her up, Jenna said, "Dad, you and Nora should write a sequel to your email. You know, let everyone know how things turned out." "We'll think about it," we replied. For a while, it felt like I had truly missed Glenn after he and Laura ran off together. Glenn had once been a fun guy to hang out with, someone who made me feel like a kid again. But by 45, what was I doing wasting time with a man who refused to grow up? When I started putting my life back together, and especially after meeting Nora, it became clear how selfish Glenn really was. Sure, I'd been selfish too, but Glenn operated on another level. His 2 short-lived marriages were proof enough, and friends don't do what he did. They don't sleep with your wife for years while pretending to have your back. Turns out their affair lasted far longer than I'd initially thought. Nora had a theory. "Why did they suddenly have to run off?" she asked one night. "Glenn wasn't just sleeping with Laura. He was jealous of you. He wanted what you had, and taking Laura was his way of tearing you down." Glenn's jealousy was the reason he forced Laura to leave her temp job to see him during work hours. When their sneaking around didn't satisfy his need to humiliate me, he pushed her to make the big break. Their escape was meant to rub my face in it, and it worked for a while. After Laura's letter circulated, it defined me in people's eyes. I even believed it myself for a time. But their happily ever after didn't last. 83 miles into their great escape, Glenn's trailer broke down. They got stuck in a small town, and reality hit hard. Glenn wasn't boring, ugly, or disgusting, but he was lazy and selfish. Laura learned that the hard way. Looking back, I realized she never gave me a chance to improve. She never voiced her complaints or tried to make things better. Maybe she didn't want me to change because that would have forced her to confront her own flaws. As Nora put it, Laura's affair with Glenn was her way of avoiding her issues. By sneaking around, she could focus on her thrill rather than her shortcomings. And that's why I'm grateful every day for Nora. She doesn't avoid problems. She faces them head-on with kindness and warmth. She's everything Laura wasn't, and she's taught me what real love looks like. One day, about a month after Nora and I got together and my divorce filing hit the regional papers, Laura called. It had been a while since I'd heard from her, and I still didn't know where she and Glenn had ended up. Without an address, I couldn't serve her the papers. The lawyer had tried email, but without proof she'd opened it, we were stuck. Laura asked to meet, and I agreed. When I told Nora, she just laughed. "Well, it's been fun, Vince," she teased. "I'll sit at home biting my nails, wondering if she's going to steal you back." We met at a Denny's. Laura looked tired, humbled. She got right to the point. 83 miles, she said bitterly. "That's how far we got before Glenn's trailer broke down. It couldn't be fixed. We had it towed to some lot where he works, and now I'm stuck living in it. Glenn's out most nights doing who knows what." She paused, staring into her coffee. "What a shock, huh?" She hesitated before continuing. "I went to donate blood and they found an STD. We don't have money or insurance. I can't afford treatment." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. She shifted uncomfortably. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," she said quietly. "But I've got nowhere else to turn. You've always had a good heart, Vince. Can you help me?" I could have gloated, but that's not me. I'd help a stranger in trouble. Why not the mother of my child? You're still on my company insurance, I said, handing her my card. You can use it. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, she said softly. What about Glenn? She asked hesitantly. He should go to County General, I replied. They'll test and treat him, and if he can't pay, they'll write it off. She nodded, then asked, Are you seeing anyone? That's off limits, I said firmly. She looked down, her voice breaking. I'm sorry, Vince, for everything, that letter. I was trying to justify what I'd done. Glenn helped me write it. He was always jealous of you. You know, your job, Jenna, everything. He wanted to bring you down. And I let him. I thought he loved me. I leaned back, arms crossed. And the letter. That was his idea. She nodded. He said I should rub it in,